The morning sun cast gentle rays across Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, illuminating the tranquil waters where America's Pacific Fleet rested at anchor. No one among the sailors stirring awake or enjoying late Sunday slumber could have imagined that in moments their world would shatter in explosions of fire and steel. At 7:55 a.m., the distinctive drone of aircraft engines pierced the calm. Not the familiar sound of American planes, but the approaching thunder of Japanese bombers and fighters. 353 aircraft launched from 6 aircraft carriers positioned just north of Oahu. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's voice crackled over the radio with the code words that would live in infamy. Tora! 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 Indicating complete surprise had been achieved. Below, on the decks of the USS Arizona, 19-year-old seaman Robert Johnson glanced skyward at the approaching planes, momentarily curious rather than alarmed. That fleeting moment of innocence evaporated as the first bombs fell, transforming the harbor into an apocalyptic vision of flames, twisted metal, and desperate men fighting for survival. When the first explosion hit, I thought someone had made a terrible mistake, recalled Seaman Richard Collins in his 1967 interview with Naval History magazine. By the second explosion, we knew America was at war. The carefully orchestrated Japanese attack came in 2 waves. The first struck military airfields across Oahu, destroying hundreds of aircraft before they could take flight. The second wave concentrated on the battleships moored in neat rows, perfect targets in what the Japanese had coldly calculated as a decapitation strike against American naval power in the Pacific. Within minutes, the USS Arizona erupted in glee, a cataclysmic explosion when a bomb penetrated its forward ammunition magazine, killing 1,177 men instantly. Across the harbor, the USS Oklahoma capsized after multiple torpedo hits, trapping hundreds of sailors inside its overturned hull. Some would survive for days, tapping desperately on the steel bulkheads as rescue teams worked frantically to cut through the ship's bottom. The last survivors were pulled out on December 9th, but many more perished in the darkness, their final moments marked only by fading taps against the unforgiving metal. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, watched in horror from his headquarters as his command was decimated. "This can't be happening," he reportedly whispered as a spent bullet shattered his office window, a moment captured in Time magazine's extensive coverage of the attack's aftermath. In Washington, D.C., the news arrived during a peaceful Sunday afternoon. Secretary of State Cordell Hull was preparing to meet with Japanese diplomats who were, ironically, delivering their government's response to recent American peace proposals. When informed of the attack, Hull's famous composure cracked as he dismissed the Japanese representatives with barely controlled fury. "In all my 50 years of public service, I have never seen a document more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions." As smoke billowed over Pearl Harbor and the cries of wounded men filled makeshift hospitals across Honolulu, the United States counted its losses. 18 ships sunk or severely damaged, including all 8 battleships of the Pacific Fleet, 188 aircraft destroyed, 2,403 Americans dead, with another 1,178 wounded. The Japanese had achieved a stunning tactical victory, but as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto supposedly remarked, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The stunning attack on Pearl Harbor catalyzed the most dramatic transformation of American society since the Civil War. Within 24 hours of the attack, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before Congress and delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech. His words, broadcast to millions of Americans huddled around their radios, united a previously divided nation. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The congressional declaration of war that followed was nearly unanimous, with only one dissenting vote, Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, who had also voted against entry into World War I. The American isolationism that had dominated foreign policy discussions throughout the 1930s vanished overnight. Citizens who had adamantly opposed involvement in another European conflict now stood in long lines at military recruiting stations. According to War Department records analyzed by the Washington Post in their 50th anniversary retrospective, military enlistments jumped from an average of 10,000 per month to over 100,000 in the weeks following Pearl Harbor. I remember my father sitting me down that night, recalled former Secretary of State James Baker in his memoirs. He told me, "Son, everything is different now. The world as we knew it ended today." This sentiment echoed across the American landscape as factories retooled for war production, rationing became a patriotic duty, and women stepped into industrial roles previously closed to them. The mobilization of American industrial might was unprecedented. President Roosevelt called for the production of 50,000 planes, 24,000 tanks, and 8 million tons of shipping, figures that military experts dismissed as fantasy. Yet by 1944, American factories were producing a new aircraft every 5 minutes. Henry Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan was turning out one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour around the clock. This industrial transformation extended to everyday life. Civilians collected scrap metal, rubber, and even cooking fats for the war effort. Gas rationing limited Americans to just 3 gallons per week, while food rationing introduced Americans to margarine and powdered eggs. The Office of Price Administration issued ration books to each American household, with colored stamps determining what and how much could be purchased. As noted in the Atlantic's 1945 assessment of the home front, Americans who had never known want suddenly learned to do without. The attack also reshaped American demographics. Millions migrated to coastal cities for defense work, creating housing crises and permanently altering the racial makeup of northern industrial centers. The Great Migration of African Americans from the rural South to northern cities accelerated dramatically, setting the stage for post-war civil rights movements. Perhaps most troubling was the immediate aftermath for Japanese Americans. On February 19, 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forced relocation of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, to internment camps. As chronicled in the New Yorker's landmark 1947 coverage, families were given just days to liquidate businesses, homes, and possessions before being transported to remote camps surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. The legality of the order was never seriously questioned at the time, noted constitutional scholar William Manchester. Fear and vengeance overwhelmed constitutional principles in ways that would haunt American jurisprudence for generations. The smoking ruins of Battleship Row represented more than the loss of human life and material. They symbolized the end of an era in naval warfare. The battleship, long considered the ultimate expression of naval power, had been rendered obsolete in a single morning by aircraft launched from carriers beyond the horizon. This painful lesson revolutionized American military doctrine and accelerated the development of the aircraft carrier as the new capital ship of modern navies. December 7th didn't just kill sailors. It killed a century of naval thinking. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later reflect in Naval War College lectures. The 8 American battleships damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor had represented the conventional wisdom of naval power. Yet, ironically, the Japanese attack missed the 3 American aircraft carriers normally stationed at Pearl Harbor. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were all at sea on various missions. This oversight would prove decisive in the Pacific War. Within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway demonstrated the paradigm shift. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk by American aircraft launched from the USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, the latter hastily repaired after damage sustained at the Battle of the Coral Sea. As documented in Pacific Fleet battle assessments, declassified in 1975, this victory marked the first time carrier-based aircraft alone decided a major naval engagement, with surface ships never coming within visual range of each other. The emphasis on air power extended beyond naval operations. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, leveraged Pearl Harbor to secure unprecedented funding and autonomy, laying the groundwork for what would become the independent U.S. Air Force in 1947. The development of strategic bombing doctrine culminating in the devastating B-29 raids on Japan, stemmed directly from lessons learned after Pearl Harbor. According to military historian John Keegan, writing in the Second World War, Pearl Harbor forced American military planners to embrace technologies and tactics they had been reluctant to prioritize. The result was not merely catching up to adversaries but leapfrogging them entirely. This technological acceleration extended to intelligence gathering and analysis. The catastrophic intelligence failure that allowed the Pearl Harbor attack became the driving force behind the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency after the war. The famous congressional investigations of 1945 through 1946 highlighted systemic failures in communication between Army and Navy intelligence, the dismissal of crucial intercepts, and the absence of centralized analysis. Never again will vital intelligence be stovepiped or dismissed, vowed General William Donovan, head of the Office of Strategic Services, in testimony before Congress. This commitment led to the National Security Act of 1947, which fundamentally restructured American defense and intelligence capabilities. Perhaps most significantly, Pearl Harbor accelerated the Manhattan Project. Although research into atomic fission had begun before the attack, the shock of December 7th and fears that Nazi Germany might develop such weapons first led to unprecedented government investment. What had been a modest research program became a $2 billion project, employing 130,000 people across secret facilities nationwide. Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, scientific director of the Los Alamos Laboratory, later remarked in his controversial 1954 security hearing testimony, "Pearl Harbor convinced many of us that we were in a race for survival itself." The ethical implications of developing atomic weapons troubled many scientists, but the memory of Pearl Harbor's surprise attack provided powerful motivation to ensure America would never again be caught unprepared. Pearl Harbor marked a fundamental transformation in American diplomatic philosophy. The attack shattered 2 centuries of American strategic thinking that had been shaped by geographic isolation from major world powers. The 2 vast oceans that had long protected American shores had been crossed in a single strike, forever changing how American policymakers viewed their place in the world. "The oceans have become highways for potential aggressors," declared Secretary of War Henry Stimson in a 1942 policy memorandum uncovered by diplomatic historians at Princeton University. "We can never again retreat behind our shores and hope the world's conflicts will pass us by." This realization directly influenced the post-war international order that American diplomats worked to construct even as the fighting continued. These foundations of what would become known as the Bretton Woods system, the United Nations, and NATO all traced their intellectual origins to the shock of Pearl Harbor. According to State Department planning documents from 1943, American diplomats were determined to create interconnected systems of collective security that would prevent any future Pearl Harbors. The attack also decisively ended American economic isolationism. The Lend-Lease program, which had been controversial before Pearl Harbor, expanded dramatically afterward, shipping over $50 billion of supplies to allied nations. This economic engagement set the stage for the Marshall Plan and America's post-war role as the world's largest creditor nation and economic powerhouse. "The psychological impact cannot be overstated," wrote diplomatic historian Barbara Tuchman in her analysis for Foreign Affairs. A nation that had been deeply reluctant to engage with the world suddenly found itself compelled to assume global leadership. This shift in perspective was perhaps most evident in America's changing relationship with China. Prior to Pearl Harbor, American policy toward Japanese aggression in China had been limited primarily to economic sanctions and diplomatic protests. After the attack, China became a crucial ally, receiving substantial American aid and military support under General Joseph Stilwell and the famous Flying Tigers volunteer fighter group. As the Chicago Tribune reported in its October 1943 special investigation, this marked the beginning of America's complex engagement with Asian geopolitics that would later include the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The Pacific region, previously considered of secondary importance to Europe in American strategic thinking, moved to the forefront of policy considerations. Navy Secretary James Forrestal articulated this shift in a 1944 planning document. The future security of the United States will depend on our ability to project power across the Pacific. We must never again allow a hostile power to dominate this ocean. This reorientation accelerated the decline of European colonial powers in Asia and the Pacific. While supporting allies like Britain, France, and the Netherlands in the European theater, American policymakers increasingly questioned the sustainability of colonial empires. President Roosevelt repeatedly clashed with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill over the future of British colonies, particularly India and territories in Southeast Asia. According to the New York Times diplomatic correspondent C.L. Sulzberger's contemporaneous reporting, Roosevelt told Churchill directly in 1943, "When we've won this war, the age of imperialism is over." While Roosevelt did not live to see the post-war decolonization movement, American support for self-determination and independence movements throughout Asia stemmed directly from policy shifts catalyzed by Pearl Harbor. The experience also fundamentally altered America's relationship with Japan, transforming a bitter enemy into one of America's closest allies. The post-war occupation under General Douglas MacArthur laid the groundwork for Japan's democratic constitution, land reforms, and economic revival. As documented in Foreign Policy's landmark analysis, From Pearl Harbor to Partnership, this remarkable reconciliation became a model for transforming former adversaries into allies, a pattern later replicated with Germany and eventually Vietnam. The 70-foot white memorial straddling the sunken hull of the USS Arizona became America's most solemn reminder of Pearl Harbor's lessons. Below its pristine surface, oil still seeps from the battleship's ruptured tanks, tears of the Arizona, as veterans called them, forming rainbow-hued slicks that dissipate into the harbor waters. This persistent phenomenon symbolizes how the memory of December 7th continued to shape American security policy long after the physical scars of battle had faded. Remember Pearl Harbor evolved from a wartime rallying cry into a perpetual national security mandate. The attack fundamentally altered the American approach to defense readiness, establishing what historian Michael Sherry termed a permanent war footing in his Pulitzer-nominated work, The Rise of American Air Power. The peacetime military establishment expanded from fewer than 200,000 personnel before Pearl Harbor to a standing force of over 1 million by the 1950s, supported by the world's largest defense budget. This vigilance extended into unexpected domains. The National Security Act of 1947, which restructured America's defense and intelligence apparatus, directly addressed failures identified by the Pearl Harbor investigations. According to declassified minutes from the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Arthur Vandenberg explicitly referenced Pearl Harbor when advocating for the creation of the Department of Defense. "We are legislating against a repetition of tragedy. Pearl Harbor occurred in part because our defensive responsibilities were scattered among competing departments." The intelligence reforms proved particularly far-reaching. The Central Intelligence Agency's founding charter emphasized the need for centralized analysis to prevent strategic surprise, a direct response to the fragmentary intelligence that failed to anticipate the Japanese attack. Similarly, the National Security Agency's massive signals intelligence operation reflected lessons learned from the failure to properly interpret intercepted Japanese diplomatic communications before Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor haunted a generation of intelligence professionals, noted former CIA Director Allen Dulles in his 1963 memoir, The Craft of Intelligence. The determination never again to be caught unprepared became almost religious in its intensity. This commitment to preparedness dominated Cold War strategic thinking. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, established in 1958, maintained constant alert status, scanning the skies for incoming Soviet bombers or missiles. Early warning systems ringed the Arctic Circle, while nuclear-armed bombers remained on 24-hour airborne alert. Measures unimaginable before Pearl Harbor demonstrated the consequences of unpreparedness. The journalist Edward R. Murrow captured this transformation in his famous 1958 CBS broadcast from Strategic Air Command headquarters. "The men who wait here for orders they hope will never come are the direct descendants of those who stood watch at Pearl Harbor. The difference is they now stand watch around the clock, every day of every year. This vigilance extended beyond military preparations. The 1950 National Security Directive NSC 68, which established containment as America's Cold War strategy, explicitly invoked Pearl Harbor. The lesson of Pearl Harbor has penetrated deeply into American thinking. The nation is determined never again to allow an aggressor to build up the strength for a surprise attack. This document, declassified in 1975, authorized a massive military buildup that would continue for 4 decades. The cultural impact proved equally enduring. Hollywood films from 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, 1944, to Tora, 1970, and Pearl Harbor, 2001, reinforced the narrative of American resilience in the face of treacherous attack. As film historian Robert Sklar observed in Movie Made America, Pearl Harbor provided American cinema with its most powerful narrative of national violation and redemption through righteous struggle. In education, Pearl Harbor became a mandatory component of American history curricula. The California Department of Education's 1954 guidelines, which influenced textbooks nationwide, mandated teaching Pearl Harbor as the pivotal moment when American isolationism ended and global leadership began. Most significantly, the phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" evolved from wartime slogan to permanent national security doctrine. Each subsequent international crisis, from the Berlin blockade to the Cuban Missile Crisis to the September 11th attacks, was filtered through the lens of Pearl Harbor's lessons about preparedness, intelligence, and the consequences of strategic surprise. Amid the sweeping historical narratives of policy transformations and military revolutions, the most profound legacy of Pearl Harbor resided in individual human experiences, stories of tragedy, heroism, and reconciliation that transcended national boundaries and military objectives. On the USS Nevada, machinist's mate First Class Robert Scott refused to abandon his post in the flooding dynamo room, declaring, "This is my station and I will stay and give them air as long as the guns are going." His body was never recovered. Mess attendant Doris Miller, without any formal training, manned an anti-aircraft gun on the USS West Virginia after helping move his mortally wounded captain to safety. Miller, who became the first African-American awarded the Navy Cross, would perish 2 years later when the USS Liscum Bay was torpedoed. As documented in the Congressional Medal of Honor Society archives, 15 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions at Pearl Harbor, many posthumously. Among them was Chief Boatswain Edwin Hill of the USS Nevada, who swam through burning oil to cast off mooring lines so his battleship could attempt to escape the harbor. He regained the deck only to be killed by Japanese strafing as the Nevada made her desperate run for the sea. The attack's aftermath produced equally powerful human stories. Lieutenant Annie Fox, the chief nurse at Hickam Field Hospital, became the first woman to receive the Purple Heart for her tireless work, treating hundreds of wounded men with minimal supplies and staff. "We operated by flashlight after the power failed," she recounted in Army Nurse Corps historical interviews. "Some men arrived so covered in oil we couldn't find their wounds until we bathed them." For the families of the fallen, closure often took decades. When salvage crews raised the USS Oklahoma in 1943, they recovered the remains of 429 sailors and Marines, but only 35 could be identified, with the technology of the time. The remaining unidentified men were interred as unknowns in the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. It wasn't until 2015, when advanced DNA testing became available, that the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency began systematically identifying these remains and returning them to families who had waited over 70 years for closure. "My cotton mother kept his picture by her bed until she died," said Laura Stavros, niece of fireman 3rd Class Kenneth Holm, when his remains were identified in 2018. "She never stopped waiting for him to come home." According to Time magazine's coverage of the identification program, more than 300 families finally received the remains of loved ones who perished at Pearl Harbor between 2015 and 2021. Perhaps most remarkable were the stories of reconciliation. In 1991, surviving Pearl Harbor veterans began meeting with former Japanese pilots who had participated in the attack. These encounters, initially tense, often evolved into profound moments of healing. Former Navy Lieutenant Richard Fisk, who had survived the sinking of the USS West Virginia, formed an unexpected friendship with Zenji Abe, who had flown a dive bomber in the second attack wave. "I hated them for 50 years, Fisk told the Washington Post in a 2001 interview. "Now I know we were all just serving our countries. We were all doing our duty." Before his death, Fisk made annual pilgrimages to the USS Arizona Memorial, where he placed 2 roses, one for the American dead and one for the Japanese. This reconciliation extended to national policy. When Emperor Akihito visited Pearl Harbor in 2016, the first Japanese monarch to do so, he stood alongside the American president to honor the dead of both nations. As reported by CNN, the emperor spoke of feelings of profound grief and eternal sincere condolences, while acknowledging the ultimate sacrifices of all those who died in the war that began at Pearl Harbor. The USS Arizona Memorial itself evolved from a symbol of American resolve to a universal monument against war. The stark white structure, which receives more than 2 million visitors annually, bears no nationalistic symbols or triumphalist rhetoric. Instead, its wall of names and the silent ship below serve as what the National Park Service calls a contemplative space for visitors of all nations to reflect on the costs of conflict and the value of peace. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded Pacific Fleet operations after Pearl Harbor, perhaps best captured this legacy when he observed of those who served there. "Among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. But it was at Pearl Harbor where their journey began. Ordinary men thrust by surprise attack into extraordinary circumstances, who responded with a courage that would become the benchmark for American military valor. As oil continues to seep from the Arizona's hull, drop by drop, day after day, it serves as a reminder that the memory of Pearl Harbor remains not just in history books or policy documents, but in the lived experiences of generations who learned its lessons about preparedness, sacrifice, and the profound human costs of war.